Wiesel founded Forum 2000 for a purpose.
We have to use the past to not becoming our children's future.
Thank you very much. I am honored to be here, and I want to thank President Havel for convening another extraordinary gathering of Forum 2000.
So those people, they are please think more seriously, and we should develop new ideas, and then important is implementation.
Dámy a pánové, vážení přítomní, já vás co nejsrdečněji vítám na konferenci Forum 2000.
The world is upside down. How should we put it back together? Are we able to act responsibly? Can we work together, play by the rules, and restore solidarity? Let's use this crisis as an opportunity. A new world emerging? Watch the online Forum 2000 conference, October 12th to 14th.
Well, welcome everyone to this final session of the 2020 Forum 2000 conference. As everyone knows, this is being held during the time of COVID. We're virtual, it's unprecedented. But I just want to say that it's been an absolutely extraordinary conference, and you've just seen some of the highlights and all the remarkable people who have spoken at this conference. President Tsai from Taiwan, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya from Belarus. I want to thank Forum 2000 and Jakub Klepal and his team, Dominika and everyone else for doing this and to sort of carry on the legacy of Václav Havel. I know Václav Havel would be very, very, very proud of what you've accomplished with this and bringing so many people together. And because it's virtual, I think it even is more possible to bring people together because people don't have to travel. And it's been an extraordinary time. And thank you very, very much. We have a great concluding panel. And I'll very briefly introduce the speakers, and then we'll get right into a discussion. We have with us here Natan Sharansky. Everybody knows Natan. He's a global figure, a former dissident and refusenik from the Soviet Union. He spent 9 years in prison. He was the first political prisoner released by Gorbachev, and then he went to Israel and he became deputy prime minister and held many other positions. And he's a great friend, and he's participated regularly in the Forum 2000 meetings. We also have with us Anna Luermann, who in 2002 was the youngest parliamentarian at the age of 19 ever elected to the Parliament of Germany. And she was the youngest parliamentarian in the world. And she has since become a researcher with VDEM in Sweden at the University of Gothenburg. But she tells me that she's going to be returning to politics, which is very, very interesting. And then also Shalini Randeria, who is the rector of the Institute for Human Resources in Vienna and a professor at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. Natan, I want to begin with you, if I may. Your very old and dear friend Yuri Orlov, who is a great figure, he just passed away. And you just wrote an article about him where you talked about how it was Yuri who took the lead in encouraging the dissidents in the Soviet Union at the time to establish the Moscow-Helsinki group and how important that was. And, you know, back then you were 11 dissidents, as Luda Alexieva once told me, 11 dissidents with a typewriter, and look what you accomplished. And what is the What is the relevance of that today when people are so worried about whether we can accomplish anything, whether the forces are simply too overwhelming to actually accomplish anything against the authoritarian forces? What is Yuri's life and struggle? What does it tell us?
Well, to understand the role of Yuri, we come back to 1975 when so-called Helsinki agreements were signed by 35 nations. And Helsinki, three baskets. One, political, about recognition of the borders of the Second World War, what Soviet Union wanted very much. Second, economical cooperation, what Soviet Union wanted very much. And the third basket was it is important to respect human. And we dissidents in the Soviet Union, those who are not in prison, are afraid that the world is deceived again by totalitarian Soviet Union, that there'll be lip service about human rights, and what they want, they'll get. And so we were discussing how we can mobilize world public opinion not to let Soviet Union pay only lip service. And I was proposing more dialogue with the international public opinion people, other things. Yuri Orlov said, enough conversations. We have to create our own group of monitoring helmets. We have to start publishing case of the violation that we know of Soviet Union. We will be arrested very quickly, but before we are arrested, our document can make the world to protest, and it will make impossible for Soviet Union to ignore. And that's exactly what happened. 10 months we were all arrested, but in this time, 20 documents about major gross violations of human rights and Helsinki agreements by Soviet Union. The world, the free world, showed unbelievable solidarity. In the American Special Committee created, which, by the way, works to this day, especially studying all our documents. There were groups of solidarity in many other countries. As a result, we were the violation of Helsinki Accords by Soviet Union, human rights obligations of Soviet Union, became the main topic on national negotiations until the death of Soviet Union. So Yuri Orlov made sure the Helsinki went into death sentence to Soviet Union. We were all talking a lot, discussing, but he was the one who said, we have two perceptions. It means that we are risking our freedom and maybe our lives, but that will make impossible for Soviet to avoid world pressure. And that was his greatness, his leadership.
And does it have relevance today when everyone is feeling so gloomy about the future of democracy?
Yeah, for sure. It reminds us that if there is real solidarity, if we are ready to remember when we are dealing with China, that there are political dissidents in China in prison, and there are the nation who are persecuted, and that human rights are really the important question on the agenda. The desire of people to express their solidarity with freedom, with democracy, is so deep, is so strong that we only have to connect ourselves to this desire and feeling of solidarity. Even the far the strongest dictatorship in the world, everybody was scared of it. The many world that we should not irritate Soviet Union. The solidarity of the free world with us, group of democratic dissidents, really changed all the political situation. That's a reminder to us we should never be afraid or shy to speak about freedom and to appeal to the solidarity.
Thank you, Natan. I want to move on to Anna now. Anna, a few years ago, you wrote an article, you co-authored an article in our Journal of Democracy where, you sort of had a message that there wasn't really strong evidence for the idea that democracy is in a global crisis. And just recently, I saw an article from Larry Diamond, a new one in the publication Democratization, in which for the first time, Larry used the term, we are perilously close and indeed have probably already entered what Huntington would have called the third reverse wave. He just said that the slow and ebbing progress over the past 15 years of democracy, the growing authoritarian trend, has morphed into a substantial, comprehensive regression of freedom and democracy in the world at the present time. Have you changed your view about the depth of the crisis of democracy, or do you still feel that it's not a global crisis?
Yes, I unfortunately, due to the empirical evidence, I had to take a more pessimistic view on the global declines of democracy. I would still not talk about a global crisis of democracy, though. Let me say that first, and maybe also sort of have a connection to what Natan was saying. I think if we would talk about a global crisis of democracy, that would mean that democracy is not in demand anymore. That sort of that the idea also is in a crisis, but that's not what we're seeing. We're actually seeing an unprecedented high number of, or we have seen it in 2019 before the pandemic hit of pro-democratic protests around the world. We have new data at the Varieties of Democracy Institute on that as well, showing that these pro-democratic movements, like in Sudan, in Hong Kong, in many other places, are actually much more on the streets than before. The pandemic has put that a bit to a halt, but still the values, I think, remain. But unfortunately, in the last years, in terms of how democratic regimes in the world are, we have seen significant setbacks. In this article that you cited from, that we published in the Journal of Democracy, I believe that was 5 years ago. Indeed, there was still the number of countries that was democratizing was still like slightly higher than the number of countries that was what we call autocratizing, so going backwards in terms of democratic freedoms and liberal rights. But now we are seeing in 2019, we are seeing that 26 countries are going backwards and only 22 countries have improved. So we're definitely in what we would call the third wave of autocratization. So we have a recent piece out also in Democratization, this journal, where we show that indeed we are in what Huntington would have called a reverse wave, or what we call now an autocratization wave. And we can see that particularly in these gradual erosion processes across the world. Well-known cases are Hungary, Poland, Turkey, and unfortunately, I would argue also recent developments in the United States, though to a lesser extent.
And how much does COVID have to do with this, in your view?
So all the numbers and data that I just cited was based on data until 2019. So this was really sort of before the pandemic hit. We've seen these erosion processes now happening. We have, as a Democracy Research Institute, of course, followed the pandemic very closely. And since March, we have started a new project that is called Pandemic Backsliding Projects. We measure, with the help of 6 researchers, the development of democracy under the pandemic now in 144 countries around the world. And what we've seen there is, on the one hand, worrisome, because we have seen in a vast majority of these, we have seen at least some violations of democratic rights during the pandemic. For example, to have emergency laws without limit, to arbitrarily enforce them, to limit the media during the pandemic. So we have seen those kinds of movements and developments in the wrong direction. However, these mainly happened in countries that were already either dictatorships before the crisis, thinking of China, for example, or they were countries that were already autocratizing, already on a downward trending, like Hungary, for example. So this wasn't such a big case. However, we have some countries where clearly now the pandemic has been used as an excuse to go further down that path, particularly with also discriminatory measures. I'm thinking here of India, I'm thinking of El Salvador, where we've seen some really, really problematic measures being implemented. So indeed, it has deepened this autocratization wave, but still, and this is, I want to end on a positive note, most democracies are resilient still, even in the pandemic. They have managed to enforce lockdowns to restrict freedom of movement without targeting those freedoms that would have been unproportional and unnecessary to attack. And we have to remember this is the standard that the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights sets for emergency measures, that they should be proportionate to the crisis, that they should be only necessary. So most of the democracies have fulfilled those standards.
Right. And Shalini, you've written about the way the soft authoritarian regimes are using COVID to try to strengthen their power. You wrote recently about India and the way, it appropriated billions of dollars to help the poor and the marginalized, but the poor and the marginalized got no support. And there's a lot of corruption. Do you want to talk about your idea of the way soft authoritarianism has been growing more authoritarian, and then also how COVID has affected that?
Thank you. So, yes, I think first we need to say a word about soft authoritarianism as a concept at all. What I'm thinking of are all kinds of regimes which are no longer democracies, although they are formally elected leaders and governments in place. So these are not military coups, these are not military dictatorships. There are no attacks out in the street. There is no overt violence by the regime, except in some countries. For example, Turkey would be a wonderful example of the backsliding, where you have a lot of dissidents, but also journalists, lawyers, and also university professors in jail. So you have a jailing of opponents. You have no murders of opponents. You have a limited amount of violence which is being used to instill fear more than to kill your opponent. So that is, if you like, the softness, one part of it. But the other is that there is a curious use of constitutions and also of law. So this is not a rule of law. This is rule by law, or rule through law. So these are countries like Hungary, but in this sense, I think the comparison with the US may also be interesting, where one tinkers with all kinds of laws about the way elections should be held, the way Supreme Court judges in Hungary are appointed, attacks on the freedom of the press, attacks on freedom of expression. These are things which are happening very slowly and gradually and eroding over the years, democratic norms, hollowing out institutions from the inside, using democratic means by formally, legitimately, democratically elected governments. So these are regimes in which you have a mixture, in a sense, of crony capitalism, a toxic masculinity. They're all led by men of a particular kind, and the use of law in order to hollow out democratic institutions, using also ethno-nationalist rhetoric. It can be white supremacist, it can be Hindu supremacy. And you have a majoritarian politics of the particular kind. What kinds of mechanisms have they used then to reduce any kind of threat to their power? So these are not necessarily ideological projects. These are very much about keeping particular strong men in power, these projects. So the one thing that they really have tried to reduce is any kind of protest and civil disobedience. And you can see that there is a reduction in many, many contexts. We have seen, as Anna said quite rightly, in Hong Kong, also currently in Belarus, and in the US, Black Lives Matter, which has resonated worldwide. So it's not just a national issue for the US. So some of these movements for equality, social justice, anti-discrimination have had a worldwide resonance. But to go back to one point that Natan made, which I think is a very important point, there was a much larger degree of transnational solidarity across Europe and worldwide when it came to dismantling the communist regimes. I think there has been much less solidarity that we are seeing these days, for example, in the case of Turkey. We have left those who are in jail, languishing in jail, without much international support for them. Similarly, I think for Belarus, I don't think there is a European solidarity which is strong enough. I don't think the EU has done enough. And I think in the case of Hungary, the fact that the Central European University had to leave Budapest and move to Vienna shows that there were obviously enormous deficits in mechanisms which are needed from supranational institutions and other kind of... So there was a lot of worldwide solidarity for the CEU, for freedom of expression, for university autonomy, but not enough, I think, which the EU certainly didn't do enough to be able to... now the ECJ has given very clear judgment 3 years down the road that Lex CEU was completely illegal. But in the meanwhile, the CEU has been forced out of Hungary. So I think the democratic backsliding is something we have to take very seriously. All of this has happened much before COVID. So the kind of measures which under COVID, so I think it's important to remember that maybe COVID exasperates certain kinds of tendencies, but it is not the motor of any of these tendencies. It gives regimes which in any case were soft authoritarian much more power to curb demonstrations or to put certain kinds of authoritarian practices in place, which will then in certain countries be difficult to dislodge later.
COVID represents this gigantic problem. We all agree. But in some of the discussions at the panels of the Forum 2000 conference, some people were talking about it also conceivably could offer an opportunity. It certainly clarifies the mind that you can't take democracy for granted. It's causing people to sharpen their resistance. Do you want to, maybe all three of you, do you want to comment on the extent to which the crisis of COVID and the crisis of democracy more largely can challenge people to fight back and possibly increase the momentum for democracy and the solidarity that Natan is talking about? Natan, you want to say something about that, and then we'll move on to Anna and Shalini?
I can say that I agree with Shalini, first of all, that you cannot blame COVID for anti-democratic tendencies, which started earlier. But and it's true that it is used as a pretext to restrict demonstrations, to restrict some other freedoms. On the other hand, all the situation with COVID, I think, is sending parallel two messages. One is importance of my home is my fortress, importance of the family, importance of the community supporting you, on one hand. On the other hand, it is the enemy that we can defeat altogether, all together. There should be no informational walls between America and Europe and so on. So this situation, at the same time, people understand that they have to go back to their identity, to their home, to their family, and they have to look for trade with all the world. Maybe that will help us to overcome this awful polarization which is between universalism and nationalism, between liberalism and identity. And in fact, I see more and more people understand and particularism can go together. And in this case, maybe if we will make it special to analyze the message in this war, maybe it will be positive.
Well, that's a very, very important point that I hope we'll take up. And that raises the question of there are really two kinds of nationalism, aren't there? There's a kind of civic and liberal nationalism, which has to do with identity and patriotism, and then a very ugly, malignant nationalism that has to do with race and ethnicity. And the question is, as part of this revival of democracy, is it possible to bring these two ideas of liberalism and nationalism together? Anna, you want to talk about that and also the possibility of fighting back?
Sure. I think there is. So what we really need to do is we need to split the debate between what is the core of liberal democracy and what are maybe some liberal values that are important policy ideas when we think about LGBTQ rights, for example, then when we think about immigration, when we think about cultural progressiveness. We need to separate that out, and that sort of applies also for the question of sort of how if you wish, nationalist, patriotic a policy needs to be. For me, this is a policy issue. And what we are seeing, what people like Luermann are trying to do is that they're trying to say liberalism is everything together, right? So if you get liberal democracy that protects courts, liberal democracy that protects journalists, that protects freedom of expression, you also immediately get liberal policy ideas like cultural progressivism, maybe less inclination towards nationalism or patriotism and these kind of things. And I think we need to sort of make it clear, and it's also part of the thing that we're trying to do at the Wiedem Institute, that we're really trying to spell out, look, if you want to count as a liberal democracy, you need to fulfill some key institutional requirements and standards. And we don't talk about policy here at all, right? And I think this is like something, the civility, this is something we need to come back to in order to stop this wave of polarization, that we really say, okay, democracy means we agree on a set of norms, on a set of rules, on a playing ground that we're playing together. But we also agree to disagree about these policy issues. And I think that is sort of key.
Shalini, I mean, when we think about fighting back, strengthening democracy, reversing the momentum, I mean, you've written a lot about how citizens can play a greater role in requiring the state to be accountable. And really, that's what's happening in so many places around the world, including some of the. But in the most authoritarian places, it's very, very hard for citizens to organize because the repression is so harsh. But how can these movements that are in the streets, how can they have a political impact beyond just trying to create public pressure from the streets? How do they enter into the political process to really make a change in policy and in the future of government?
So, Carl, this is really the million-dollar question, I think, because it's easier to mobilize people to come into the streets, and you can do this using social media quite effectively to protest, to occupy, and it's much more difficult to build institutions. Using social media, it's much more difficult to turn a movement into a movement which is able to reform institutions or design them differently for greater participation, for greater tolerance, for diversity. And that's what we need. We need a democratic culture. And I think one of the things we need to think about there is, if you like, it's a very old-fashioned word, but it's the question for me is not only an institutional one, but how do we socialize people into the values of democracy? Now, for example, I think the family is an area where you can socialize people, children, very early on into democratic values of tolerance, of equality, of genders, etc. I think the austerity politics of the last years have done severe damage to a lot of institutions and democratic spaces in all our societies. Simple things like public libraries, where people across all social classes can come together in a neighborhood, or public swimming pools, public parks. When you privatize all of this, and you whittle down public expenditure into all the things which could inculcate not only values by teaching or preaching values, but just allowing people the opportunities and spaces to practice democracy, tolerance, to come together, to learn to live with differences, etc. I think you are doing a great disservice to the kinds of citizen education we need. I think we need to think about more civic education here. We've done quite well in teaching people about human rights, about also gender rights, although there's a huge backlash on gender rights. This is a subject I don't want to go into over here, but there's a very, very strong backlash on women's rights everywhere, especially in all the soft authoritarian countries. But so I think the question is, can we teach people that very abstract ideas like an independent judiciary, freedom of expression, electoral rules, which sound sort of quite technical, quite legal, quite abstract, that these are the foundations of democracy. As Anna says, this is not a policy issue. This is the very core and foundation. But the question is, what kind of civic education would it take to teach people that? My last point that I want to make here is, and you are very right, that there is a problem about coming from the streets. You can monitor, you can try and render institutions accountable, but that alone in the national sphere is not enough. You really need supranational institutions, so I think one needs to think in a multi-level sort of way where political action can take place. And COVID, of course, has one advantage. We are all in a virtual sphere where a lot more is possible than we had realized until now, because but the space of democracy is no longer just the street. It can be mobilizing at a different level. But what does that mean to mobilize pan-European, for example, or transnational, is something that we need to think about. My last point is, Carl, and that is my major worry. So this is not a positive, optimistic comment. This is a very, comes out of my deep concern about what is happening. And that is, when we think about COVID, what has happened is citizenship rights. So we've seen a lot of solidarity across the board among citizens, but it's been partly at the expense of human rights. I think we've forgotten the whole question of immigration, of asylum seekers. Look at what is happening in Greece on the border after the Moria camp was burnt down. So I think there is a lot more attention needed. COVID has focused us onto the national plane, and we somehow need to think more broadly. And in the national sphere, my major worry is that the whole question of who is the demos, who belongs to the demos, has become a very fraught question, because in countries like Hungary, but even through voter suppression in the US, one is redefining the demos. Whose vote counts has become a huge question, with diaspora populations in Hungary being brought in. If they are going to vote for Orban, those who have left the country who may not vote for him, makes it very difficult. So I think the redesigning of the demos is a major issue.
Okay, I want to move it on. And you raised the point about the weakening of the center. And, at the first day of the conference, Natan, Yossi Klein Halevi, who I'm sure you know very, very well, raised the point about the weakening of the center. And you're going through that in Israel. That's how do you deal with this kind of a problem, the problem of polarization? Because when you talk about civics, Shalini, you're really talking about how do we strengthen a national consensus around liberal values, the values that bring us together, not the politics that divide us. And Natan, in answering that, if you would also just bring in a point that you made recently in an article you published in Newsweek about, you saw warning signs in the contemporary United States and in the West, you saw warning signs of what you called the signs of totalitarianism, a kind of fear society, people being afraid to talk, a cancel culture, demands for ideological purity. To what extent is that also a problem today?
It is a start from the first thing. We in Israel, for example, can clearly see, and I can't say that that is direct result of Corona, because when so many people are unemployed, so the desire to go to the street and to change the situation is bigger. But it's so we can see on the left clear movement that we want change in government from the results of the elections. No elections, we, the people, demand to change the government. On the other hand, on the right, we clearly demand there were elections, and that's why there is no in the court. What it means to send to just one so big election. So, in fact, that's an attempt to replace the institution, the whole of the court by the will of the people. And I think in all this polarization thing, the only thing which we have is to defend our institutions which protect our democratic society. And that has to be a red line. You can argue that a prime minister is good or bad. You can argue whether the way you wanted or didn't want. You cannot argue about the right of the court's decision, the right of the people to make their decision, the right of the government. That's the key. Now about my last article, which I wrote with Gil Troy, with whom we just now published a book about it. It is, fortunately, it's really painful to say, but I see some sign of totalitarian society, of communist society coming to the free world. And first of all, it is the phenomenon of doublethink. Doublethink which is so typical for the regime, when the majority of people don't say what they really believe in. They are afraid to speak publicly. It main criteria for me, totalitarian society. That is the difference between fair society and free society. And in the last 15 years, I started seeing it on the campus of the United States of America, and now broader, even in the newspapers of the United States of America, that and more people prefer not to express their views because they can be not popular. There is a poll in America Institute that 6% of Americans prefer not to discuss publicly their political views. That's something very alarming. And the second sign of when ideology, that's what matters. The Soviet Union saw the world as oppressors against oppressed. Oppressors are always wrong. Oppressed are always right. And that was the right to destroy the whole class of people because they are their own history. In this cancel culture on both sides, we can see it, the desire to say that the other side is of the history, that's why their opinion is not important. It's really early signals. Of course, free world is very far from the world of communism. But we have to be warned.
Okay, thank you, Natan. And Anna, I invite you to comment on that. I also just got a question from the audience, which is, it comes back to what we talked about before. Is this crisis useful for the promoting international cooperation, where states and international bodies can rather come together rather than lead to more isolation? And I have in mind that the European Union in July, passed a major new initiative about called the Next Generation EU, in which they created a new fund to support the poorer countries to enable the European community, the European Union, to hold together more. And does this crisis, which could divide us, does it also have in it forces that might bring different countries together more so that they could protect themselves better? Can it lead to a kind of new form of cooperation and solidarity? Anna?
Yes, I think it can, because fundamentally this is a global crisis that we all experience around the world. So we have, first of all, reality, a common problem that currently affects us all around the world. I mean, when I have calls now with people from all corners of the world, we're all sitting at home office due to COVID-19. We all had the problems with closing schools, the health worries about ourselves, about our families. So I think sort of a shared lived experience, first of all, creates the understanding that we share this humanity, that we share, live in the same world and share the same problems. However, when we saw the first reactions to the crisis in March and April, particularly in Europe, I mean, borders closed. Look, I'm a German citizen. I live in Sweden. I have most of my friends and family in Germany. And all of a sudden, there was almost no way for me to get home. I mean, this is an experience that I thought as sort of a child of the post-Cold War area that I would never experience again, that I would have a problem of traveling within Europe, right? So this initial reaction brought out sort of some of the worst instincts of sort of badly understood nationalism, of closing borders, of thinking first of their own community. We had discussions about that masks shouldn't be exported anymore and these kind of things. But then I think, as you rightly pointed out, at least in the EU, I'm not sure about the US president here though, but at least in the EU, I think leaders have taken the right conclusions from these setbacks in March and April with a relatively daring package in July, indeed, that includes a lot of movements of solidarity. So there is the hope here. We will have to see how it continues also with the WHO, where the US in particular has sent. Has basically refused solidarity here to the international body dealing with the crisis. So I think sort of the bag is a bit mixed. Maybe one final thought on an opportunity that lies in the crisis, sort of more on the individual level. I think what a lot of citizens around the world have seen, how precious our life is and how precious our order is, and how much we actually need each other for our day-to-day life to work, and how much we need also a functioning state and a democracy to ensure that, and how much they can actually intervene with our life in a crisis like this. So I think that was a moment or a thought that I've heard from many people that I've been. So for me, this is sort of the hope that people stop believing this narrative that we don't need the state, that politics doesn't matter for you, because we've really seen how politics matters for the health and life of each and every one of us.
Right. Shalini, I'm going to pose this question to you, but try to be short in your answer, because I want to come back and ask one concluding question. We have from someone in the audience the concern about the impact of COVID on the poorer people, and how can democracy really be strong if societies are so unequal and if there's such great poverty. And that also gets to what I mentioned before that you wrote about, the way India said that it was going to appropriate monies for the poor, for the marginalized, but that the poor and the marginalized never saw that money. So that's also a governance issue, an accountability issue. And is there a way to address this issue through citizen pressure from below? Try to be brief, because I want to come back to one last question. Go ahead.
So just two quick reactions to that. I think it's not a very, empirically also this generalization cannot be borne out that democracy only succeeds in countries which are rich. India is a wonderful example of a country in which despite every prognosis from all the American political scientists in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I remember at least 30 books that we were made to read in school and college that Indian democracy would die for all kinds of reasons. It didn't die. It's a resilient democracy. And interestingly, in India, as opposed to Europe, it's the poor who have always saved the democracy. They've always gone to the ballot box. The rich stay away from votes. It's the poor who go always and change governments. And so I don't think there's a simple equation between, can democracy be saved because there is so much poverty? The poor have suffered enormously under COVID in India, and they've suffered on two reasons. One, because on the whole, the economic downturn, plus the fact that most of them work in the informal sector, which doesn't provide any social protection or safety nets, has taken away all the means of livelihood, plus not enabled any social protection by the government. They have also suffered because many of them are migrant within the country, and they were forced to leave the urban areas in which they had been living and working. So the suffering has been really very, very unequal. So yes, we are all in the same boat as far as the virus is concerned, but the impact on those who are poor has been that much worse. With the poorer countries in the world, especially think of the African countries, with very few resources to mitigate it. So I want to say just one thing on that, and that is we haven't touched on it, but I think global inequality matters, and it'll matter when it comes to vaccine distribution and access. So vaccine nationalism is one of the major problems. Even if we get a safe and effective vaccine, if we don't have people joining the WHO COVAX mechanism, for example, which will try and ensure access to everybody equitably, we will have a problem. The two countries which have not joined are the US and Russia.
Right. Well, that's a challenge for the future. And let's hope we get a vaccine soon. Then we'll deal with how it's distributed to the world. But we have one question from the audience, which is also similar to the one that I was going to raise at the end, which is the role of a rising and increasingly totalitarian China, and whether it offers a kind of a geopolitical or ideological alternative. Certainly Xi Jinping has sort of said that it will. When we organized the call to defend democracy in the spring, we were really looking at what the foreign minister of the European Union, Josep Borrell, called the battle of narratives, where China was trying to make the case that you need a strong, centralized totalitarian system in order to deal with a problem like COVID. How do we fight and win the battle of narratives against totalitarianism today? And to what extent does the role of people at the grassroots have fighting for this in Hong Kong, in Belarus, in Sudan, and other countries? Can they inspire a new commitment to democracy on the part of the international community that might give us a stronger hand in fighting this battle of narratives against the authoritarian countries? Natan, you start with the answer to that question.
Well, my answer is the same as I was giving for 20 or so 40 years. When leaders of the world ignore the fact that their major partners are totalitarians, it's grassroots who have in the free world who have to remind them about the importance of this issue. For years, we heard that China is a good example, that they gave economical freedom to their people. They kept their communist totalitarian character. And in fact, at the end, it's China and it's good for the world. It's very bad for people in China, definitely for national minorities and for victims of regime. Totalitarian regime maybe can have some tactical successes in controlling COVID. But first of all, the world didn't know in time about this. And because there is higher quota of information between China and the free world, it's many reasons. So it is very important. The national institutions institutions, to keep the question of human rights and democracy as nature linked with all the other problems. It's difficult to do when international institutions are under control. Just now, I think yesterday it was, there are new members of Human Rights Council elected. Who are these new members? Russia, China, Cuba, Afghanistan, and so on. When these countries are responsible for human rights in the world, of course we'll have the situation that China is getting free pass, and in the end, gives us many problems for universally for all the world.
Anna, how do we fight the battle of narratives and win?
I think first by debunking the myths that authoritarians are spreading around the world. First, authoritarian countries are not better in fighting COVID-19. You don't need to restrict democratic standards. We have done an extensive study now based on the data that I outlined before, where we looked at countries have violated democratic standards now during the pandemic, and the authoritarians of this world always claim that this would make them more effective, and this is really not the case. There's no relationship between violating democratic standards and COVID-19 lethality. I think this is a message that we need to set and bring out there very clearly. On the contrary, particularly when it comes to COVID-19, we can see that transparency rules. I mean, let's think about it. What crisis might have been averted if there would have been transparency and media freedom in China when this all started, and if doctors really would have been able to contain it at its very onset. So that's number one. Autocracies don't perform better in COVID during the COVID-19 crisis. And second of all, we've taken something very serious that Larry Diamond has said to us at our Varieties of Democracy annual conference, I think by now 2 years ago, to really think about developing a business case for democracy. So we all know about the normative values of democracy. And as you said, the protesters in Sudan and Belarus remind us about this all the time. And that is clear. But also democracy has a value in terms of performance for the people, deliverables for the people. And we're just now doing an extensive review of sort of all the studies that are out there that work on this issue. And one thing that is clear, yes, you can always find these spectacular autocracies that have for some years spectacular growth rates or other performances in anti-corruption work, for example, but these are always outliers. If we look at the data and the bulk of the authoritarian regimes, they grow less, they have more inequality, they have for their people, worse educational systems. So I think this is a message that we clearly need to send. That just sort of because China had some years of high economic growth, they had decades of really, really bad economic performance, and most of the autocracies out there perform much worse than democracy. So I think we need to make this business case for democracy in all the normative arguments.
Right. We should never forget that China is today, as we speak, committing what is considered under international law genocide against the people of the Uyghurs in East Pakistan, Xinjiang, and also in Tibet. But you raised the issue of democracy performing, and that really gets into the issue of governance. And it's not enough just to have democracy. It's also necessary that the democracies have to perform responsibly. And the question is, how does that get done? Shalini, do you want to add anything to this discussion on that point of governance in addition to democracy?
No, I don't want to go into the governance discussion. I mean, I would underwrite everything that Anna just said about the performance of autocratic governments under COVID has not been any better, regardless of what the narrative is. But I don't think the narrative, countering the narrative, is just enough. I think, for example, if we want countries to, especially lower-income countries in the world, to maintain or even promote further stable democracies, for example, we need debt relief. I think the IMF really has to come up with writing off debt. It's not just a narrative question. I think it's also a resource question. And if we drain these governments of the kinds of resources they need in order to really counter a public health crisis, to counter all the kinds of things which are going to happen, the economic crisis as a result of the pandemic, you are going to get populist reactions supporting authoritarian governments. So I think it's not just narratives. We really need to build resilient institutions on the one hand, but we also need to think about the political economy. And for that, I think debt relief will be really central for countries which are lower income countries. The second point I want to make here is I think countering China's soft power in Africa, for example, will need that kind of help because China is providing all kinds of infrastructure investments, etc., etc. They're not going to go away just because of a narrative on democracy. We really have to be willing to do something. Democracy promotion is not happening very much. The autocracy promotion is happening quite well. And we need to think about what are the kinds of measures we want to take there. Media, I think, is a third point which we need to think about. So much of this disinformation is happening, fake news, etc., through the media, and I think we need to figure out what kinds of measures are needed to put in place to ensure independence of media and freedom of expression. And my final point would be, I think we really need to think about strengthening democracy at a very local level. The feeling of disempowerment or powerlessness, which citizens in so many parts of the world are feeling, and I think Brexit is one consequence of this kind of feeling, it can only be countered at a very local level. And so I think we really need to think from the local through the nation state, which has been strengthened, to a global level.
Okay. We have only a few more minutes. I'm going to read the summary conclusions, ideas that have emerged from the conference, and I'm going to ask you all maybe to comment for 30 seconds on it, and then we'll sum up and conclude. One is that there are 5 points that emerged from this conference, according to Forum 2000. There's a need for global solidarity and responsibility and cooperation. The COVID-19 pandemic must not overshadow other problems like China or what's happening today in Nagorno-Karabakh. The International Alliance of Democracies should stand strongly behind those who are struggling for democratic values. We need to strengthen the values that are a prerequisite for freedom and democracy. And finally, a functioning global order is not possible without collaboration of democracies. Natan, Anna, and Shalini, do you want to comment? And I'll give you 30 seconds to comment on these concluding points from the conference.
All the points are fine. All the points are fine. This connection between universalism, between efforts in one country with the world, and well, there was said many right things about it. I have nothing to add, only saying that we will save liberty only together with identity.
Thank you. Anna?
Yes, I think I want to emphasize particularly the point of the collaboration of democracies, that this is key, and particularly the support for newly transforming regimes, because luckily we still have them. And one key example is Sudan. I mean, I lived in Sudan for 2 years when it was still a full-fledged dictatorship under Bashir. Now the Sudanese people have managed to remove this dictator and are embarking on a very, very complicated transition process. And the international community is trying to support it, but it's not. The support is not arriving on the ground as fast as it has to be in order to help this country to really move in the democratic direction. And just just one example here is that Sudan remains on the list of state sponsors of terrorism in the US, which is really harms this whole process so much. For example, I've been there in February now and worked with activists to try to help them, give them some skills on how to develop parties, how to become transformative actors now in the political process. I wanted to invite them then to my Zoom lectures on democracy, and I couldn't because Zoom is banned in the United States. Is banned in Sudan because of this ban from the side of the United States. So I think we really need to step up our game in this very challenging time to support those precious movements that are there that generate a momentum for democracy, and then also democracy will prevail globally.
Okay. Shalini, 30 seconds.
Yes, Carl, just to one question. I think if we really mean to strengthen democracy, we need cooperation among democracies, which means we have to finish with the hypocrisy, the politics of hypocrisy, where one pays lip service to democratic freedoms and rights, but then continues to do very good business with dictatorships. I think we really have to then put our money where also our values are.
Thank you very, very much for that. Let me just say, as somebody who is sitting here in Washington, D.C. in the United States, that, I've always believed that if the United States doesn't stand tall for the values that are inherent in our country, that democracy in the world will be in trouble. And we have to return to the support of these values. We have to return to trying to become, if not the leader, certainly a leader in the struggle for freedom and democracy. And I know everyone is looking at the election that's coming up. It's a very pivotal election in our country's history, and I invite you all to say a prayer for our country that we can go through this process in a peaceful way, and then in the aftermath to return to the values that have united our country. I also, in conclusion, I started by thanking Forum 2000 and thanking the Czech Republic for hosting this conference. And I, want to conclude by saying that the central value, Natan started this discussion with emphasizing the importance of the value of solidarity. And this is certainly something that Václav Havel spoke about very much. And as I noted, that it is through Forum 2000 that we are connected to Havel and his legacy, but also to people today in the Czech Republic who are representing these values. And there, of course, is the mayor of Prague, Zdeněk Hřib, who has established a sister city relationship between Prague and Taipei, and then also the Senate leader, Miloš Vystrčil, who led a delegation of 89 people from the Czech Republic to Taiwan just a few months ago, and he spoke before the Legislative Yuan. He was the first head of parliament from a foreign country to speak before the Legislative Yuan, and in that speech, he intentionally echoed John F. Kennedy when he went to the Berlin Wall in 1963, and he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," and Miloš Vystrčil said, "I am a Taiwanese." This was a magnificent expression of solidarity at a time when China is threatening Taiwan very seriously and also threatening any countries that will stand with Taiwan. It's a symbol. It's a symbol of how we have to stand with people in every country, in Belarus today especially, but also in Kyrgyzstan and so many other places where people are fighting for freedom and democracy. Also in a country like Sudan, where they did have a breakthrough in 2019, but now struggling to consolidate that new democracy, and they need our support very, very badly. This conference has brought us together around these values. These values are being challenged today, but there are things happening in the world which could signal the possibility for progress in the period ahead. And we have to be ready for that, and we have to prepare to continue this battle. Thank you to Forum 2000 for bringing us together, and we look forward to the conference next year to be physically with each other and not to do it virtually. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of the year.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you a lot.